All right. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Commissioners Board briefing. It's March 11th, 2026. I will bring this meeting to order at 2 p.m. Welcome. Did you sign the guest list, Deborah? Okay, well, we have a bunch of topics today. We'll try to get to all of them. We may not. There was this advice, you may only get to one, see how it goes. But the first one's going to be an update. It'll be our financial assessment with Nick from Tiberius. We're gonna plan on an hour, but we're good to go.
Nick?
Hi, Nick. Are you ready?
Hi, I'm here. Happy to start in. I don't know if Rachel has any introductory comments first.
Nope, I already told them that we may take a little bit more than an hour if needed, so we don't have the pressure of time as much with this topic. But the county hired Tiberius, Nick and his team, to prepare a financial assessment. It's one of the things that has been, again, long overdue that we have finally brought to conclusion, and he has prepared a slide deck to accompany the draft report that you all received. I think it was last week or the week before. So it is in draft form. If there's any edits that need to occur out of today's discussion, we can incorporate those, but we are expecting to wrap it up soon. And there's no adoption needed for this assessment or anything like that. It's just a report out. All right, Nick.
Thank you. And I will plan on sharing my screen unless the presentation is already up on the screen somewhere in there.
Yeah, go ahead and share your screen, Nick, then you can drive the slides.
Okay, will do. Okay, are folks able to see that?
Yes.
Terrific. And with the way this displays on my screen, I'm now unable to see you, but we'll be pausing throughout for folks to have questions, discussion on the financial analysis that we have here. We will try to move quickly through this so that we don't take the entire meeting, but we definitely want to make sure everyone has plenty of time to discuss the implications and any questions on the financial analysis.
Thank you.
And Nick, as we're moving through it, would you like us to ask questions as they occur to us or save them up? What's your preference?
So we are going to have in this presentation these kind of 7 topics that we cover. And in between each topic, there will be a break in the slide deck before we move on to the next one. And so by all means, ask questions along the way, but we will be pausing between each of these sections to make sure you have an opportunity for questions and discussion then.
Great, thank you.
Certainly better than listening to me drone on for 30 or 40 minutes and then asking me a question on something back on slide 2. So
Right, thank you.
So the purpose of this analysis was to provide a thorough evaluation of the county's fiscal position. This is not intended to make any specific policy recommendations to the county, but just informing future county decisions. Additionally, this is not meant to be just a one-time analysis, but to provide the county with a flexible tool that can be used to update and run additional scenarios in the future as conditions change. The reason why this analysis is a little unique, I mean, that the county looks at its financial position every year during the budget process. You do an audit every year. There's an entire finance team whose job is to focus on finances. So a lot of this is information that you will have looked at in one way or another. But by having this long-term analysis, looking back in time, 1 or 2 decades, doing a projection for the next decade into the future, you can wind up having a different sort of perspective than the traditional analysis where you're in budget season and you're looking just at a snapshot in time. How can we balance the budget for next year? I was actually talking with another jurisdiction earlier today about a similar concept where the budget process, if you imagine that you're in a boat and you see that it's leaking, you're focused on patching those leaks. But if you zoom out and look at a longer timeline, you may see that boat is headed to crash into the dock. And so by seeing that bigger picture and where things are headed long term, you may realize that there are different priorities that need to be addressed from a financial perspective rather than just the constant looking at next year's budget cycle. Additionally, we know this isn't the only financial effort that the county's been working on. Dating back a year or two, the county was already working on identifying a long list of potential financial enhancements that includes new or enhanced revenue streams, as well as cost-cutting measures, and that the county's been working on prioritizing those efforts to begin implementing them. We were involved in a small part of that last year. And so we view this piece of work combined with all that other prioritization work that's already been ongoing. Those are just different pieces of the puzzle, and these pieces can all come together to inform a future county financial plan that's really establishing concrete steps for how the county makes financial improvements. So again, we'll be stopping along the way to cover each of these topics that were in the report that we put together. It's a 50-page report and a 40-slide presentation, so it is a lot to cover. But hopefully, by pausing throughout, we'll have the ability to kind of grapple with each of these sections individually. So our first section of the analysis had to do with a policy audit. Ideally, if you're doing a financial evaluation for a local government, you'd start by identifying all of the government's adopted financial policies and confirming compliance with those policies, looking at whether those policies may need to be updated or changed. But for Tillamook County, there really aren't that many formal adopted financial policies in place. So what we have on screen now are a list of the topic areas that the National Government Finance Officers Association recommends that local governments include through their adopted financial policies. General fund reserves, grants, debt, economic development, investments, long-term financial planning, just a host of different topics that are recommended as best practice to have official adopted policies on. In green, we've highlighted investment. That is the one area where Tillamook County does have some detailed formal adopted policies. We've highlighted a few others in yellow related to procurement, grants, risk management, and internal controls. There you might not have official detailed adopted policies, but there are sort of best practice documents, other work that's been done to lay out policies and procedures related to those topics. And then everything in gray are areas where obviously the county's doing work. You have capital expenditures, operating budget, et cetera. But the county lacks formal documentation of official policies on those points. And this is not a catastrophe. Not every government has adopted policies on every one of these recommended topic areas, but it is a best practice. And something for the county to consider moving forward is, can you adopt actual clear policies related to each of these points? And in doing so, will that help you accomplish your financial goals? So we'll pause there to talk about the policy audit if there are any questions. That is the shortest and simplest section of the presentation, so maybe there's not too much discussion, but pause here before we move on to talk about the historical trends.
I'd really love it if Deb was willing to respond to that. Like, when you look at this, how does it inform your vision for the department?
We've always known that we could use some standardized policies to refer to as we move through budget process, as we point to different problem areas in our financials. So seeing it depicted in an image like this just really hits it home that we are sorely lacking in solid black and white references that we can use as we try to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Clearly, there are procedures because you're doing these things, but it's just not set out in place.
Correct. Yep.
Thank you.
And Deborah, I feel like at one point Sean had the GFOA set of policies that she had done some work on and that she had sent out. So I don't know if any of that is going to be useful or usable work as you go forward or not, but I feel like there was some work done, although absolutely never circulated, socialized, or finalized.
Right, correct. We do have a draft copy of another county's copy pasted
Mhm.
work for us. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't have anything. you're good to continue, Nick.
All right. So moving on to the historical trends. In this analysis, we primarily focus on the general fund, though we will cover a few other funds later on in this presentation. The historical period we covered, we pulled financial data really as far back as the data was available in a useful format. And so we were able to look at detailed line item expenditures and revenues for the general fund from fiscal year ending 2009 until fiscal year ending 2025. So we've got a 16-year period of historical financial data. From that, we really dug into the details on both revenues and expenditures to see what sort of trends the county has been experiencing. And again, you all have been living through this and have experienced it firsthand. So a lot of what we go through today won't necessarily be earth-shattering revelations, but it does provide clear data that really maybe solidifies and clarifies the financial challenges that folks are already aware that the county is facing. So this first slide, we're looking at revenues first before expenditures. This is looking at the growth in revenue line items over that 16-year period. Here we've highlighted the 10 largest sources of revenue for the general fund in 2025. And we are sorting them by how rapidly they've grown over that 16-year period. The fastest growing revenue source over that historical period has been short-term rental permit fees. Obviously, you go back to 2009 and this funding source didn't exist. There was a major boom in short-term rentals across the country that happened over the last 2 decades, and that includes here in Tillamook County. And the county established this fee and saw very rapid growth in it in the last decade. The asterisk there is because, again, this didn't exist back in 2009, so we're only showing the growth rate over the last 10 years. It's also worth putting an asterisk on it because that growth is not projected to continue in the future. So this has been your fastest growing revenue, but we know that short-term rentals are a politically contentious issue for the community, and we know that there's been county policy to put a cap on the number of those units. And so based on that, we are not anticipating that this strong growth continues into the future. Other fast-growing line items that we see here include interest earnings. A lot of that is because interest rates have ticked up very significantly in recent years. So as your fund balances have grown, the interest earnings that you're getting off of those have also increased due to higher interest rates in recent years. We see intercounty indirect cost allocation. That's been growing at a relatively rapid rate. That's not really external revenue being generated for the county so much as reallocating those funds from other county departments to help pay for their share of the general fund overhead costs. Beyond that, one thing that stands out here is that we see property taxes in the middle of the chart here. It is the single largest source of revenue for the county. That is true for every county in the state of Oregon because of our property tax system. It is the largest source of funding, but it is also relatively slow growing. It plods along just a little over 3% per year over time, and that is by design from Oregon's property tax system. We then see state timber revenues, the second largest source of revenue, contributing $4 million in the last fiscal year. And we see that over this period of time, it has had much slower growth. This has been a very volatile revenue that has gone up and down over the last 2 decades, but overall has not seen much sustained growth over that period of time. One thing to point out down at the bottom, this covered the top 10 largest sources of revenue. There are dozens of other revenues into the general fund, and when you combine all of those other revenue sources, they have been declining over this period of time. There has been not a lot of widespread growth in revenue. So the county is really being propped up significantly by this slow and steady growth in property taxes. And then we see these few other fast growing line items into the general fund. But beyond that, there has not been strong, broad-based revenue growth. In addition to looking at how these revenues grew over time, we also looked at how volatile these revenues are over time. This really hinges on this final column to the right, standard deviation. a standard deviation. We're getting into statistics over here. I won't belabor you with the technical details, but this is really just a measure of how far away from the average the volatility is from year to year. And so very unsurprisingly, we see at the top of the list property taxes. These revenues on average grew at 3.9% per year. That's the same as the 4% we were showing on the previous slide. But the standard deviation is only 1.4%. What that means is that in that 16-year period, there was never a year where assessed value or property tax revenue grew by more than 6%. There was never a year where you had a decline in those revenues. They always grew by at least 0.2%. Very closely, tightly clustered around the average of 3.9. We can contrast that with the state timber revenues, where on a purely mathematical average, it also grew by about 3.4%. That is just the annual percent change each year of the 16-year period added up and divided by 16 gives us an average of 3.4. But we know that the compound growth rate, when we look at the, where you wind up after 16 years of growth, that was only showing 1% growth per year. The reason for that is because of this significantly higher volatility in this revenue line item. So there are years for state timber revenue where you're seeing a 30% increase or a 30% decrease. And if those decreases are happening after you had years of large amounts of revenue, so now you're getting a large percentage decrease, and then the following year you get an equal percentage growth, well, you're growing from a smaller point. So it doesn't get you back on track. And so even though the average growth rate that you see for property taxes and state timber revenue are pretty similar, the volatility has led timber revenue to really not keep up on a compound growth rate perspective. It is very close to where it was 16 years ago, whereas property taxes have had that sustained growth over that period of time. We can see that the volatility is high for things like federal grants. You don't know when those revenues are going to come in from one year to the next. Obviously, transfer from the Revenue Stabilization Fund, that would be off the charts in terms of its volatility. If we looked at all the years where there were no expenditures, this is or no revenue coming in. We're only looking at the years in which there were revenues from that source. So we have a lot of these larger revenue sources that do have a fairly significant amount of volatility from year to year. Still, overall, the county being propped up by the old, reliable, and steady property tax revenue, slow, steady growth, very low volatility. In addition to growth, volatility, we also looked at budget variance. So the budget variance is looking at how do the actual revenues in a given year compare to the budgeted revenues in that year. And if you were always getting the exact amount of money that you budgeted, you would have a variance of 0. We see that for indirect cost allocation, that's been very close to 0. Planning and zoning fees, very close to 0. We have a few of these large revenue sources that have a negative variance. That means that the actual revenue being received is less than what's budgeted. The top one on the list is the transfer from revenue stabilization. That's up there as no surprise. In your budget process, you may budget that you'd be having revenue come in from the stabilization fund. But if that was ultimately not needed and you don't transfer that money over, then your actual revenue is lower. That is not a concern. That is just how the budget process should work for these potential allocations of revenue stabilization fund money. Down below here, where we have some with positive variance, that's showing situations where actual revenues outperform what was budgeted. And for the most part, when we look at your budget, we do see most revenues come in, actual revenues higher than what's budgeted. So property taxes, that's the case. Federal grants, timber revenue, short-term rental permit fees and interest, all of those have been coming in higher than what was budgeted. None of those really seem like any cause of concern, though we will note that the interest earnings coming in consistently so much higher than what was budgeted. Maybe that's something to think about during upcoming budget processes, to take a closer look are we estimating interest revenues appropriately given where interest rates are today? Then on expenditure side of things, we looked at the largest expenditures by department here and how they've grown over time. We can see not a huge amount of variation. Almost all the county departments have been growing around 3% per year on average over the last 16-year period. We see general county government is higher than that. It has had stronger growth over that period of time, though some of that has been from volatility that's occurred over those years. There's a long list of departments, and so we only are showing the largest ones here, but all other departments are still hovering around that 3%. We will get to a slide later in the presentation that shows historically your expenditures from the general fund have been tracking very closely with inflationary cost growth over that period of time. And so if we've had around 3% annual average inflation, that's also reflected in the growth in your departmental expenditures. This is drilling down to look at the fastest growing line items. So even though each department has been growing by close to 3%, we see there are certain line items that have been growing faster than that. Almost all of these are small line items. So if you see that your $24,000 a year heating, we shifted short forward one. If we see that your $24,000 a year heating fuel budget has been growing by 11% per year, again, not a real cause for concern because it's such a small slice of the overall pie. It does show that legal costs and bank fees have been the fastest growing cost drivers, but again, very small dollar amounts, less than $100,000 per year. The only two line items on here that show up as more than $100,000 per year with these relatively high growth rates include computer software and licensing and travel, training, and mileage. Again, on the computer software and licensing, not a red flag from our perspective. This is over the last 2 decades. There has been a lot of modernization that's been going on at the county as well with lots of other governments. Our world is ever more reliant on technology, and a lot of these technology systems, local governments try to limp along as long as possible before they do these upgrades. And those upgrades are costly and expensive, and you sign up for new software packages. That type of growth in costs from these modernization efforts are expected. Travel, training, and mileage is something to keep an eye on. In large part, that may be due just to overall trends in the increasing costs of travel. Mileage reimbursement is based on the cost of operating an automobile. And if you have gas prices increasing or you have the cost of vehicles increasing, that mileage reimbursement is going to go up as well. But in talking with staff, it does sound like there's not necessarily formal policies to control and to try to restrict travel, training, and mileage across the county. And so maybe tighter controls could also help to keep that particular line item from growing in future years at such a high pace. But beyond that, all these other fast growing line items that we see are low dollar amounts. In terms of volatility, we see at the departmental level generally significantly less volatility here than on the revenues. So when you're putting together, the budget for the sheriff or the assessor or the county commissioners themselves, there has not been a huge variation from year to year in how much those expenditures are. We do see down at the bottom, non-departmental and general county government having higher levels of volatility. Generally speaking, I'd say if you've got departments that are more project focused, so there's a special project or a capital project that they're trying to deliver, you will see those costs be more volatile than if you have something like the sheriff's office or the assessor, which are funding staffing levels that are predictable and they're providing a level of service that generally stays constant from one year to the next. So not necessarily anything concerning here, but anywhere where you see large amounts of volatility, it just may make it more challenging during the annual budget process. Now we look at the budget variance analysis. So again, looking at how actual expenditures compare to what was budgeted. And we could see that for the most part, we are looking at negative figures here. So most of these departments are spending less revenue each, or have lower expenditures each year than they were budgeted for, which is good. You typically do want to budget for some contingencies. You want to give yourself the spending authority to spend grant dollars if they come in. And so you may be budgeting on the high side, and then you want your actual expenditures to come in lower than what you budgeted. And we're seeing that here. Only a couple of these line items, the general county government and non-departmental, have these positive budget variances. Those were two of the most volatile departments from the previous slide, and it is always more challenging to accurately budget for a department that has volatile numbers that fluctuate from year to year. Beyond that, there's generally not a concern or a red flag if your actual numbers are coming in lower than what you budget. You may want to shoot for a target of being within plus or minus 5% of what your budget is. And in which case, again, we only see the one outlier on general county government exceeding that. Other departments are generally in line. Again, maybe you're coming in farther below budget than you might want to. I don't think anybody really ever complains about coming in farther below budget. So this slide is, we'll cover this one, and then we'll pause to talk about the results of the historical analysis before we move on. I think this may be one of the more useful slides of the entire presentation. Here we're combining the general fund revenue analysis and the expenditure analysis over the past 16 years to show whether the general fund was operating at a annual surplus or deficit in each of those years over time. This chart clearly shows that the county general fund is facing financial challenges. For the past 5 years, we've seen the county general fund operating at a deficit. But it also shows that this was not always the case. From 2012 through 2020, we see that the county general fund was on an upward trajectory over that period of time, and that really things have changed pretty significantly from that 2020 time period. The reason for that change, a lot of that's driven by state timber revenue. So 2019 and 2020, the two biggest surpluses shown on this chart, those were also record-setting years for the amount of state timber revenue that the general fund received. That revenue from 2020 to 2021 dropped by $2 to $3 million. And so that's how you get from a $2.5 million surplus to a small deficit. You could trace almost all of that back to the fluctuations in the state timber revenue. That being said, on top of the reduction in state timber revenue, we also fundamentally see a different pattern in the growth of revenues and expenditures pre-2020 and post-2020. So from 2009 to 2020, the county saw its annual revenue grow by 2.8% per year. Its costs were growing by 2.3% per year. So your revenues were growing faster than costs. That's how you have this improving financial position, and it led to several years of surpluses in a row. From 2020 to 2025, that annual revenue growth has slowed down to only 1.1% per year, while the cost growth has increased to 4.4% per year. So in these most recent years, costs have been growing significantly faster than revenues over this period. Again, some of that is attributable to changes in state timber revenue, but on the expenditure side of things, that's clearly not related to that, largely driven by much higher inflation that we've seen in recent years. So this kind of, I think, crystallizes the history of the county general fund, when it was doing well, when it started to do more poorly, and the magnitude of that problem over the last 5 years. So we'll pause there before we move on to spotlight a couple of key revenues and then start looking at our forecast figures.
Okay. Okay, Nick, so I'm usually the optimist here, but there's a point I want to ask you, and if you could point out that I've always found as a discrepancy is the revenue over the past 17 years, going back to 2009, is not adjusted for inflation. So this was one of the things I noticed on timber revenues. We were averaging $4.5 million, but since there's been a 50% increase in those 17 years in inflation. So the purchasing power of $1 million in 2009 would take $1.5 million this year. So to me, it feels like the revenues kind of keep up with inflation because we're paying what we're paying. But doesn't this show that we would be even worse? These numbers should be worse if you take inflation into account for revenue, because if we're making $4 million steady for the last 17 years, that $4 million has way less buying power, but yet cost of insurance, cost of employees, cost of fuel, cost of everything else has been going up by 3%. But we're not accounting for that. So that's the confusing part I have, is I feel like we've continually been doing more with less, but we're acting like it's better than it is. Am I not reading that right?
No, I think that's definitely correct. You know, these numbers here on this screen, you know, both the revenues and expenditures here are in their what we call nominal dollars. So in 2009, we're showing the dollar values that were reported in 2009, recognizing that any dollar back then is, as you mentioned, worth, you know, 50% more than a dollar today, given the inflationary pressures. We have certainly seen some revenues, like property taxes, that are able to keep pace with inflation. It's not growing a tremendous amount more than inflation, but it's at least keeping pace and exceeding it in a small amount. But yeah, the many of the other county revenue streams have not been keeping pace with inflation. And meanwhile, almost all county costs are rising at least the pace of inflation. And so that dichotomy is what's causing the problem, especially when in the most recent 5-year period, revenue growth has slowed dramatically at the same time that inflationary cost pressures have increased dramatically.
And the reason I pointed out, I appreciate that. I'm not the money guy. Everybody else is probably more the money guy than me. But one of the things I think, which is why this work is so good and so important, and what Deborah's doing for us now is, and I noticed this just when I was running, before I was even in the seat, was we now are basically talking about that, because we were saying we're doing fine, we're even at 4.5 million or $4 million a year, but we weren't. We were actually spiraling the drain, and we weren't talking about it. So I think now we are, and now I think we're looking and we're starting solutions. But that's an important discrepancy there, where it's actually worse than it appears, and which means. It just means we're on the right track, but I just want to point that out because that keeps getting lost to me when we do these reporting. But we look back 15 years or 17 years. So that's my biggest comment. Do you have any questions for his?
No, I don't. I think if you looked back operationally, and those of you who've been here longer than I have, you would see that we went through periods where we reduced the number of staff that we had significantly in order to adjust to exactly what you're saying, Paul, which is without the growth of timber revenue, we had to reduce our expenses so that we didn't outpace it sooner than we have. But now we have outpaced it. And you're right, it's because it was a flat dollar amount of timber when you average it over the whole thing. I think they said it was a 1% growth for timber over that window of time. And we only managed to be okay, you know, because that's what you're pointing out, as we said, we've been okay. And we were that because commissioners gave 0% raises, right?
It's a 1% increase, but if it's a 3% cost of living or CPI or inflation,
right, exactly.
It's 2 steps back.
Correct, which is what
it's a net loss every time.
Correct. And what we did to manage that is commissioners prior to, and the things we've been trying to get away from is they did it on the backs of staff, right?
Right.
Because they didn't have any other way that they could see to do it. So it's those pieces where we were 4 people in the treasurer's office down from previously 6. I don't know how far back you have to go to see where we were okay, and then to operationally see where we started slicing and dicing in order to stay okay in a non-increasing revenue world. But yeah, because you're totally correct.
Yeah, and these numbers would be worse, you know, if it weren't for all of the actions that the county has taken historically to try to control those costs. And so, you know, we know that in 2015 and in 2025, both of those years there were transfers in from the Revenue Stabilization Fund. If those transfers hadn't happened, those deficits would have been a lot worse. I talked to staff about the various sort of austerity measures that were taken in 2015 with furlough days, travel and hiring freezes. Those types of actions prevented the deficits from being worse. And so this chart is not a particularly optimistic and uplifting chart, but it's also disguising the magnitude of the problem in past years because you're constantly doing the best job you can in the budget process to try to control these costs in ways that are less than ideal for the services you want to provide.
Thank you for that. That's what I was trying to get to. That point is we don't want to do that if we can help it. So we're trying to do it a little bit differently because we've had to decrease services like the road department. We've got to cut that and over the time. So
I appreciate your point because it helps to explain why, setting aside the anomalous 2019, 2020 timber excess, that it helps to explain how and why we hit the tipping point. It seems to me like 2021 was a tipping point where we're no longer treading water,
Mhm.
and so I think that it's helpful to have the explanation.
thank you. Anybody else? Anybody in the room have any other questions? Comments? Okay. All right, Nick, we can move on if you'd like.
All right. So we have
Thank
just
you.
a couple of slides here where we're doing a spotlight on key revenues, the property taxes and state timber revenue. They come up over and over again because of how large they are and important to the general fund budget. And these slides have both actual historical data and our forecast projections on them. So they didn't fit nicely into either of those sections. So we just kind of put them here as a segue between our historical analysis and our financial forecast going forward. Property taxes, just to highlight here, again, this is the picture of stability. It doesn't matter whether we have recessions or boom times, we see property tax revenue plodding along at this 3.5% to 4% growth per year. We expect that trend will largely continue into the future, though it's almost imperceptible. We do think it might slow down a little bit. Part of what fuels the growth in property taxes, it's a change in assessed value that comes from appreciation and new construction. Appreciation is capped at 3% per year by the state constitution for all individual properties. So anything that gets you above 3% growth is dependent on new construction. That new construction is generally driven by population growth. You have more people moving in, you need more homes and businesses to serve them. And the most recent state forecasts of population growth for Tillamook County show population growth cooling off compared to historical trends. So, long term, you've been averaging about 0.8% per year in population growth. And the latest forecast over the next decade calls for something closer to 0.5% per year. Much of that population growth is due to migration, whether that's internationally or just from elsewhere in the United States, folks moving into the county. And, something that's not factored into the most recent forecast is that there's basically been a standstill on that international migration. It is too early to say how that might play out in terms of population growth for Tillamook County specifically, but it's unlikely to lead to a boom in population here. So there may be even slower growth than we're showing right now. Again, it doesn't have a huge impact on the trend line, but if you go from having 3.9% growth per year to 3.5% growth per year in property tax revenue, that's just a little bit more headwind when you're trying to do everything you can to encourage revenue growth for the county. So generally speaking, very stable, very steady growth, but it may be slightly ticking downward with new construction from new population slowing down here. The next one we have here to compare it to is the state timber revenue. Again, a very different looking chart due to the volatility. So you can see the 2019 and 2020, those two boom years. We can see that we're actually in a period right now. The last fall, the state provided their most recent forecast of timber revenue and showed that the current fiscal year that we're in, 2026, looks to be a good year. And it looks to be improving over the next couple of years. But beyond that, their longer term forecast calls for things dropping back down to where they sort of are today. And then not a lot of optimism at the state that there's going to be significant growth from that point forward. And so we could see if you go all the way back to 2009, you were looking at just a little short of $4 million per year. You look at all this time in the 20 teens, looking right around $4 million per year. Look at where we are today, right around $4 million per year, and this forecast right around $4 million per year. So this flat line on revenues, while as was just mentioned, inflation is chugging ever upwards. So the purchasing power of this revenue stream keeps declining. It's a little interesting to compare the two charts. You go back to 2009, again, just below 4 million for state timber revenue, just above 4 million in property taxes. So they were not that far off from being an equal share of your budget. And you look at where you are today, 2025, 9 million in property tax revenue, projected to head all the way up over 12 to 13 million over the next decade. And meanwhile, we just have timber revenue plodding along here, bouncing along at that same $4 million threshold. So while these two revenue streams used to be almost co-equal when it comes to the importance to the county's budget, state timber revenue continues to be left behind as property taxes keep that growth going.
Those two are my favorite slides so far, Nick. They really
Yeah,
are. Those are the ones we need to show the Board of Forestry when they talk about this stuff. It's like there's a discrepancy. We'd have
Yeah,
to cut more timber to get that number higher,
Right.
which isn't gonna happen.
Not happening.
Sorry.
No, it's great. I mean, those two slides needed to be in there because those two revenues are just so important compared to everything else in the county general fund. Any other comments on those two revenues before we start looking at our forecast analysis?
I just want to make one mention though, and we won't get to it in this presentation. I know that, but what would be interesting is if you did that same graphing with TLT.
Sure. Yeah, we can
If
do.
you did that graphing with the TLT revenue, it would follow the property taxes. 'Cause
Yep.
It would.
Yeah, it went and then woo, and then it kind of leveled off and
It's
yeah.
7
but yeah,
million now, so it's exceeded anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, that's just want to make that point that property taxing should be our minimum goal for all of our revenues and fees and everything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cassandra has her hand up. I don't know if you.
Yeah, Cassandra, sorry, I didn't see that.
That's okay. Hi, Nick. I'm Cassandra Larson. I'm the county assessor. Nice to meet you.
You too.
Two notes. We did have 2 years, 2011 and 2014, where our assessed value was under 3%, like 2.7 and then 2.5. One of the questions I had was about when you're looking at population growth, right? Because everybody wants to know what is the assessed value going to be next year? What can we depend on? About 60 to 70% of all of our new homes are in our coastal communities. 49% of our property tax statements go out of the county. So is that factored into your projection?
Yeah, our projection, it didn't, but it is something we could expand on to look at the different tax rate that the county collects in incorporated versus unincorporated areas. We did factor in that not every property is going to get 3% growth per year. So we looked at in order to get that 3% growth, you need to have headroom. Your assessed value can't be higher than your real. And I'm not telling this to you, Cassandra, as the assessor. I know you know this, but I'm explaining to the rest of the room. The 3% growth per year in your assessed value can only happen if it doesn't put you above your real market value. And certain properties, typically, we see it more in industrial properties, they don't have real market value above their assessed value. Their real market values are languishing for one reason or another. And those properties don't have any ability to see any growth in their assessed value unless real market values improve. And so when we looked at the breakdown of the ratio of properties in the county, according to their assessed value to real market value ratios, at this snapshot in time, it looked like we could, count on maybe 2.85% overall appreciation, and anything above that requires new construction activity. And so when we took that 2.85% and then added assumptions for population growth and new construction activity. That's what got us to, I can't remember the exact figure, something around 3.5% per year, which again is a little below what we were looking at historically at, an average of 3.9%. So, but I'm
Yes.
happy to look at revising the forecast to try to do a little bit more nuance. We had a lot of conversations with Rachel and Deborah on the property tax forecast because it's been so steady historically. Again, during good times and bad, it's like, well, how much effort do we want to put into the forecast to know that it's going to be more or less 3.5% plus or minus a couple of tenths of a percentage point, because it is just such a rock solid revenue stream. But certainly we could continue to tweak it, especially because a small drop, if it does only grow at 3.2 instead of 3.8, that compounded over time does spell problems for the county general fund. So,
And one of the points I was trying to make though was that population growth is that the same as the people who have their second and third and fourth homes here.
oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah. Because like I said, 60% of our new homes are from people that don't live here. So I don't think that's in that equation. Yeah, we've had assessed values go up almost 6% in the good years.
Right.
Yeah, good point.
I wonder when we run out of buildable land.
Right. Cassandra, is that it? Can I move on to
Yeah.
Sarah? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you for that, though. Sarah.
Thank you, commissioners. 2 comments. Hi, Nick. I'm the Community Development Director. My name is Sarah Absher. In terms of projected population growth and how that intersects with property tax revenues, I think that one comment that's relevant in this conversation is we are currently building to house population that already exists within our county, and using our Housing Production Solution Fund, the other tools that we are finding in our toolbox. And so while the population projections may decline slightly, I think in terms of property tax revenue, as we see these housing efforts come online, property tax abatements complete within the next 10 years, it'll be interesting to see how those perform together in terms of actually increasing property tax revenues, even though our population projections may not be entirely on the rise. And then Commissioner Bell, to your point about buildable land inventory, that is actually the next piece that we are doing now with Senate Bill 406. We're doing the housing capacity analysis and buildable lands inventories throughout the county. So that'll be interesting information to share with everyone within the next year when that work is done. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Sarah.
It's
I was
one
thinking about
one response to Sarah's comment there, which is all I agree with all those points. One thing that we like to keep an eye on, and I've been seeing more and more in other communities, is the impact of tax abatement programs for new housing. So you go back 10 years ago, and there were very few tools in the toolbox for jurisdictions to incentivize new housing construction. And so the state has made strides at creating and advertising and getting a lot of traction for tax abatement programs for new multifamily construction. But as more and more projects qualify for those tax abatements, you wait longer and longer for that assessed value to come onto the tax roll. And so we are seeing some communities now who are realizing in their quest to build more housing units, which were desperately needed, they've now created an issue where they are not going to have as robust of assessed value growth as they're used to seeing. And that's presenting new challenges for those communities. So again, we haven't dug into that level of detail because we were kind of a mile wide and an inch deep on these sorts of forecasts. But it's something to keep an eye on, is how those abatement programs interact with population growth, economic development goals, and the property tax revenue that you need to fund all your services.
Thank you, Nick. We have actually been talking about that, so that is on the top of all of our minds. So thank you for that. I think we're ready to move on. No one else has their hands up.
Okay, so moving into our forecast, looking forward to the next 10 years, Again, a 10-year future forecast looks a little bit different than a typical annual budget forecast. It's much harder to be spot on accurate with a forecast 10 years from now than it is to be accurate for your projections for next year. You know, if you look at property taxes as an example, the property tax revenues next year are based on construction that happened last year. So you're very unlikely to be surprised by a change in assessed value for next year, because you would have seen those cranes, the construction going on in the community for the past 12 months, and would know what's happening. 10 years from now, there's a lot more volatility. In particular, you know, there could be political changes, economic changes, social and technological changes. All those things could help to transform the community, and they're all impossible to forecast accurately over 10 years. So why do we do a long-term forecast? Again, it's to see where this boat is headed so that we're not constantly focused on the problems of today, but understanding, do we have larger, more structural problems that need larger structural solutions to be able to set you up for long-term financial success, instead of always just being in a cycle of every year looking at budget cuts on this annual basis. So for our revenue projections, the general fund has 50 to 60 revenue line items. It was a manageable enough number that we forecast each of them individually going forward. For each one, we looked at one of three general methodologies. The first one, this is kind of wonky language here, long-term inflation adjusted average. So what this was is for a revenue stream that has been bouncing all over the place in the past, something like federal grants, where it doesn't follow a predictable trend line. We looked at the actual amount of revenue received over each of the last 16 years. We adjusted those historical revenues for inflation to bring them all up to today's dollars and looked at what that average amount was. Then we took that average amount and forecasted into the future, but again, indexed it to anticipated future inflation growth. So that's how we handled those more volatile revenue sources. For many of the other sources, particularly small ones that had less than $10,000 of annual revenue, and other ones that showed that they had predictable historical trend lines, we used their historical percentage-based growth over the last 16 years to forecast them into the future. Then there's another subset of, I'd say, the most interesting forecasts here. And in the report, it lays out in detail each of the line items that we used each of these formulas for, where we did do a percentage-based growth factor, but it wasn't based on its historical trend. It was based on more nuanced and specific forecasts. So based on population growth or employment in key industry sectors. Sometimes we had state forecasts that we could point to showing growth or a lack of growth for state shared revenues like cigarette, liquor, and marijuana taxes. We mentioned earlier that we had a specific forecast for the next 3 years for state timber revenues. So where possible, where we knew that there was a revenue that was highly correlated with another variable, and we had stronger forecasts for those external variables, we used those as the basis of the forecasts. We've talked about inflation a lot, and so before we dive into the rest of our forecast, we've got a couple of slides that show this inflation data. This is showing the historical trends and the projection. This looks almost like a straight line if you were to try to look at this chart, and it makes it seem like inflation has been a pretty steady game over this period and into the future. You can see a little bit of a ramp up in the early 2020s, as everybody knew we were dealing with high inflation, but it doesn't look that significant on this chart. This chart, however, is showing the annual percentage increase in inflation. This is based on the Consumer Price Index. So the most widely, the CPIU, the most widely used inflation index that the Federal Reserve puts out. And this tells the story a lot more, with a lot more impact as to how it's actually experienced and felt, both by households across the country and by the county trying to balance your budget. So the Federal Reserve, their target inflation rate is 2%. And we can see that for much of this history, this is showing the growth from 2009 until 2010. So we're only showing the 2010 as a start point here. But from 2010 until 2020, for that decade, inflation was right about at what the target inflation rate for these, PhD economists, they want to see it at around 2%. We even happen to have 1 year in history where we saw deflation over this period of time. But starting in 2021, this is largely as a response to the COVID pandemic and all of the money that was put into circulation at that point in time. We started to see just absolutely off the charts inflation, inflation rates that had not been seen for decades before this. And so we see it grow up over 3%. And then in 2022, inflation over 8%, extremely painful for everybody involved. And although it has been coming down, it has been stubborn. And so we have seen inflation still above 3% for each of the last several years. Last year, inflation finally dropped below 3%, but it's still elevated above the 2% target. And projected inflation rates in the upcoming years, while still dropping down, do not get back below that 2% target and remains elevated compared to the historical trend. Not a huge difference, but it is projected to be higher than it has been in the past. And even with, when we see the inflation rate come down, that doesn't mean prices go down. That just means that the prices are going up less rapidly than they were in those recent years. So we had a very strong growth in costs in recent years. Those costs are not coming down. They are continuing to grow. And it does look like, based on the best projections out there, that folks think that they are going to see inflation remain slightly higher than the targeted rates, which is not great news for anybody trying to balance a budget. Noteworthy that this analysis and these slides were put together before we had the current geopolitical crisis, before oil was up over $200 a barrel and bouncing around like it is. Nobody can tell you today what inflation is going to be like in these next few months, because there is just far too much political global uncertainty on that question. But it's certainly worth keeping in mind that we may be seeing a dramatic rise in inflation over these next few months, given the current actions going on in the Middle East. So the result of all those forecasts, again, the report includes more detail on these, and then we have a massive spreadsheet that county staff have that allows you to drill down on any individual line item. But we can see revenues anticipated to grow. This is slow and steady growth, and it is mostly driven by that property tax revenue. It's 40% of the total revenue that the county general fund's receiving, and it's anticipated to keep growing over time. We can see the state timber revenue. It does have some growth over the next few years, but then you see that bar start to shrink as it drops back down towards today's levels, and then is pretty flat during the remainder of the forecast here. And again, just not a tremendous amount of growth in the other revenue sources, looking at historical trends and the factors that drive the growth in those revenues. So we see property taxes do a lot of heavy lifting, and we see that lead to slow and steady growth in general fund revenues. When we look at expenditures, for expenditures in the general fund, you have hundreds of line items, far more than we can do a practical line-by-line forecast. And so we were looking at more general methodologies. And one thing we saw early on in this analysis is that you go back over the 16-year period, and general fund expenditures have been tracking as a whole very close to the pace of inflation, the consumer price index. And we can see that in these two lines here. And yes, they bounce around. We see in 2020 and 2021, expenditures were a little bit higher. That was fueled by more resources being available in those years from the outlier of the timber revenue that you had then. We can see back in 2011 and 2012, there was a little bit lower than the pace of inflation. Again, those happen to be pretty low years for timber revenues. But the long-term trends that we see here are that the general fund expenditures are basically just treading water with inflation. One thing to note is that you might look at that and somebody might say, well, that's I guess one form of success, that our expenditures have been able to keep up with inflation. But because you actually have a growing population, you would like your expenditures to be able to grow by more than inflation. You'd like your expenditures to be able to grow by inflation plus population growth. that would really be the level that's needed so that you could continue to provide the same level of service to a growing population. And if you're only keeping up with inflation, or if in future years you wind up not being able to keep pace with inflation, that's where you wind up having reductions in the level of service because you're just not able to serve the growing population at the way that you used to be able to provide that service. And we've heard commissioners mention that tonight or this afternoon with talk of cuts to different departments that have happened over the years. So for most of our line items, we are forecasting future expenditure growth to keep pace with projected inflation growth. However, that's not necessarily true for all of our line items. There were certain general ledger codes and certain departments that did show that they had historically consistent growth faster than inflation. And so for these line items in the budget, we applied an additional factor to show them continuing those trends of growing faster than inflation. On the general ledger codes, almost all of these things are driven by sort of broader, national or global trends. So computer software and licensing, we've talked about modernization efforts and moving more and more towards a computerized world. Insurance and deductibles, we know healthcare, but then insurance of all types has been growing much faster than overall inflation. Health services, again, the cost of health service has been going up. Travel, mileage, and training, again, we've seen those costs accelerated in recent years. So there are a host of these line items that we've seen have higher than inflation growth. Those continue. We also identified a list of personnel-related general ledger codes. Historically, the county has really sort of been barely keeping up with inflation when it comes to personnel costs. But we also know that, again, it was brought up today, that a lot of balancing the budget has been done on the backs of these public employees. And that recent efforts to look at compensation for county employees compared to comparable employers elsewhere showed that the county was not keeping up. And so I know there have been changes recently to try to get things more in line with where compensation should be. There is a separate inflation index that is tracked for state and local government employees. And that state and local government employee index has been showing those costs across the country growing by about 1% higher than inflation every year. So if inflation over the last decade was 2.75%, inflation for state and local government employees has been closer to 3.75%. We anticipate that going forward, there's going to continue to be more pressure on personnel-related costs than on other costs. That the costs of employees are going to continue to go up faster than general inflation. A lot of that isn't necessarily due to salaries, but due to their benefits and the health packages and insurance that you have to offer. So we use that in our forecast going forward. This is also a good time to point out that these forecasts going forward is kind of, two general categories of financial forecasting. One would be a financially constrained model, and another is a not financially constrained model. We're showing a not financially constrained model. So we could have done a forecast that said, well, we only see your revenues are going to be this amount. And so because of that, we're going to manually tamp down all of these individual costs because you can't afford them. We aren't showing that here. We're showing where we anticipate these costs would naturally grow to unless the county winds up taking specific actions to control those costs or to generate more revenue growth. We want to be able to show the magnitude of what this deficit is on pace to grow to. And then you could consider interventions that can help bring about more positive financial outcomes. So with that, we have our forecast of increasing costs for the county. If we were to toggle back and forth for the general fund between the revenues and expenditures, we would see that in 2026, especially in the current base year of 2025 that we started our analysis working from, revenues and our expenditures are in a very similar place, very small amount of deficit. When we look at the growth over the next 10 years, we see our expenditures significantly outpacing the growth in revenues. We see over this 10-year period of time about a 40% growth in expenditures compared to an 18% growth in revenues. Obviously, that's not financially sustainable. And so something is going to need to happen. Probably several somethings will need to happen for the county to be able to balance the budget and control these costs and increase revenues. But given the standard inflationary pressures that we're seeing and the historical trends that look like they will continue, this is the direction that we see the county general fund headed towards. So we will stop there again for more questions on our forecast before we start to look at a couple of the other funds we examined.
Thank you, Nick. I'd like to go, I have a few questions going back to that chart that was population versus, were you talking about, I think it was population versus inflation. One of the things I want to say was that as we do our forecasting, what I'm concerned is we are unique in that, look to Cassandra's point, 60% of our tax records go outside the county. So our population growth for the last 20 years or 10 years has been like 0.7%. We have our population in the fastest growing population, people over 65. So like we don't have to say, I'm just worried that our measuring stick is geared towards maybe a metro area. I just want to make sure that we're gearing it towards what we should be focusing on, because like visitor industry, which we haven't talked about at all anywhere here, and I know that's on purpose, and we will get to that. But you know, that's the fastest growing revenue source, even beyond property taxes, percentage wise, is our transient lodging tax. And so I just want to make sure that as we're projecting the doom and gloom and the optimism, that we're using a realistic measuring stick.
Yeah, we can certainly take a closer look at the property tax growth. When we used our variables of a 2.85% increase annually from appreciation, recognizing that not all the properties are getting 3% growth per year, and then adding percentage for population growth in the past, we saw that did a pretty good job of projecting the actual historical growth in assessed value that we saw here. And so we used that going forward. We used it because it was a little bit more conservative than just extending the historical trend, since we do anticipate population growth to slow. One thing we could do is try to look at some other factors for estimating future construction activity. We have data at the countywide level, not data, but a forecast at the countywide level on growth in the construction industry, for example. And if you have a growing, thriving construction industry, that's indicative of new buildings being built, new homes and businesses. And so we can look at some other variables to see if they correlate as well as population growth. And it may tick it up again a few tenths of a percentage point. It's unlikely to make a dramatic change in our forecast, but as one of the conclusions we come to later is that even small changes here, sustained over a long period of time, do have big impacts on the end result. So we can certainly take a look to see if there's justification for a little bit more optimistic assumptions on the property tax growth.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure if there is optimistic. I guess what I'm saying is I just want to, even if it's doom and gloom, I want the number to be accurate. I just want to make sure that we're closer to a ski resort in Colorado in terms of our economy now than what we historically have been. The timber industry, like most of Oregon, it changed. You know, the timber industry decline in harvest and Measure 5 and 50 have put us where we are, among other things, and we've just been reactive to it. So we are in a proactive stance, but to do the best forecasting and planning, we have to be honest about what our, we have folks that, come up to us and say, oh, we need more industry. Well, we don't have a railroad and our roads are falling apart. So we're not going to get the same kind of, we can't bring in the same kind of traditional businesses that we've relied on. And so I want to make sure that our forecasting and plans reflect that. We're more likely to get a 100-room hotel here that's going to create all kinds of revenue for the county through taxes and TLT and all kinds of other peripheral stuff. And that's more, unfortunately, or fortunately, we're lucky to have it. Other Eastern Oregon counties wish they had our tourism industry, but because of they're facing the same timber revenue decline. So I just want to make sure that I feel like I just want to make sure we're looking at it accurately, whether it's optimistic or negatively. I can plan better if I know what we should be shooting for, knowing that our population is aging, and that's not going to change. And the houses, I mean, Cassandra could answer this better, but there's not really a shortage of high-end houses for sale in Tillamook County, but there's definitely a shortage of affordable housing. We said we're building houses for a population that's already here. We have housing projects that we're funding that won't increase our population. So I just want to make sure, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole there. I just want to say that, not that any of this is wrong, or I want it to be more optimistic. I just want it to be, make sure that we're reflective of the actual community that we're in, because if we still keep thinking we're going to get timber revenues over $10 million a year, it's never going to happen. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think it might be interesting to look at some of the building trends in Tillamook County and to factor those into the property tax piece of this to see if it does generate anything different. Because I think, Sarah and her department have a pretty good handle on who's building what, and frankly, what's still available out there to be built. So what are we likely to see into our future? And to your point, it may or may not make a significant amount of difference, Nick, but it would be nice just to know and to kind of make sure that what we're basing it on is making the most sense. Because we do have a slightly different set of factors that drive our assessed value. Because of our tourism economy and our second home economy, frankly.
And our 52% is public land in this county. We don't have like a UGB. Like
For me, I see this piece, and I don't know how far in the future it is, where we start to lose that growth in our property taxes because we start to lose the ability to continue to construct. Where we move into a phase where we just don't have the lots available. I think, a look at Pacific City, when you remove the wetlands, et cetera, shows there's about 27 or 30 buildable lots down there that are reasonable anymore, right? And yet, if you look at the buildable lands inventory overall, it looks like there's a ton of land available in Pacific City. So, I think some of those nuanced pieces are things that might impact our future, our estimate of future property tax growth.
Yeah, and I think it was Sarah that mentioned earlier upcoming work related to Senate Bill 406, but the housing capacity analysis and buildable lands inventory that are going to be worked on soon. And having those studies done, where folks are specifically looking at the amount of new construction and the absorption of new units into the future, the price points that those units are going to be targeted towards. Being able to have those studies done will be a great input to run an updated version of this property tax forecast to make sure that this long-term forecast is aligned and using the same data and assumptions as those housing-related studies are. So
perfect. Thank you.
Hey, Faith, anything?
I agree with my colleagues and with Sarah that it's our population isn't growing much in terms of people moving here. However, certainly we have construction growth based on everything everybody else has said. So I do think that needs to be factored in.
Okay, Nick, I don't see any hands up, so if you want to continue.
All right, we will skip ahead. We're getting towards the home stretch here. So our other funds, we looked at, let me just, before we dive into the state, the Timber Trust Fund. It's not going backwards. We looked at three other funds in this analysis. So we did most of our focus on the general fund, but we looked at the Forest Timber Trust Fund, the Building Improvement Fund, and the Revenue Stabilization Fund. We looked at these three because they're sort of linked to the general fund. Many of them receive funding from the general fund, and some of them also have the potential to send funding back to the general fund, but they are interconnected. And so as the general fund experiences financial pressure, looking to see whether these funds will also be under pressure or whether they have the opportunity to relieve any of that pressure for the general fund. Under the Forest Timber Trust Fund, just pointing at to start this fiscal year, there's basically no fund balance in this fund. This fund is the exclusive revenue source here is state timber revenue. So most of the state timber revenue going into the general fund, but a small share coming into the Timber Trust Fund. As we've talked about throughout the day, that's a highly volatile source of funding. It's been relatively low dollar amounts deposited into this fund. And this fund has only been using that revenue to pay for legal costs and memberships and dues. Those legal costs have been growing significantly in past years, but that was largely due to specific legal challenges that the fund was facing. In the future, it's unclear whether there would be the need for those large legal expenditures moving forward. But if the expenditures here continue to grow at a pace equal to inflation, meanwhile, the revenues, if they grow at a pace equal to the state timber sales, you're going to quickly reach a point where the revenues are not keeping up with expenditures. And this fund would wind up being unsustainable long term if it has growing expenditures and is relying on state timber revenue to provide the funding for that. When we look at the building improvement fund, there's a little bit larger fund balance here, about 1.3 million at the start of this fiscal year. It also has fairly volatile funding, primarily from transfers out of the general fund to the building improvement fund. And it also has, in recent years, seen a fairly significant amount of interest earnings. At one point in the past, it also received, over $1 million of land sale revenue, which was very helpful for funding these activities. But again, that's happened once in the last 16 years and is not anticipated to happen in the future. And there have been actually some changes to state policy that impact the county land sales as well. So we do not anticipate that being a significant source of revenue moving forward. So this is very reliant on general fund transfers to keep this fund going. If the general fund is in a position of ongoing structural deficits, it's hard for the general fund to continue making transfers into the building improvement fund. And so the activities that this fund covers, buildings and improvements, but maintenance of those buildings and grounds as well, this sort of, nuts and bolts, taking care of your infrastructure and your facilities, that is dependent upon the general fund being able to provide support here. And with the general fund being in a difficult financial position, I would say that this fund is likewise in a difficult financial position. The last fund we looked at was the Revenue Stabilization Fund. It has a little over $2 million in beginning fund balance at the start of this year. Again, it's funded exclusively through general fund transfers and interest earnings. That means it has a very limited ability to support the general fund in future years. So in 2025, we know that I think it was $1.5 million that was transferred out of the stabilization fund back into the general fund. And in the current fiscal year, I believe it's planned for $1 million to be transferred from this fund back into the general fund. Those large transfers are helpful for taking care of temporary budget deficits, to be able to help the general fund weather a storm. But if there are sustained ongoing deficits, there just isn't the fund balance in the stabilization fund to be able to keep doing that year after year. And so we could get another couple of years into the future. And if the general fund needs to continue relying on transfers from the Revenue Stabilization Fund, the Revenue Stabilization Fund will go out of funding. It needs to see the pendulum swing the other way, where the general fund is healthy enough to continue putting money back into this fund to help for future rainy days. So right now, again, when we look at all of these funds, they are at risk the same way that the general fund is at risk. This is just a chart of that Revenue Stabilization Fund beginning balance. And so we can see, only 2 times over the last 16 years have we seen the fund balance go down. That was from 2015 to 2016 as it drew down $500,000. And then from 25 to 26 as it drew down $1.5 million. There were a few years where money was contributed back into the Revenue Stabilization Fund. So we can see the large growth in 2022 and 2023. Beyond that, it's largely just been collecting a small amount of interest earnings each year. And so you see this very slow, gradual buildup. So, this fund, again, is entirely dependent on the general fund being healthy to be able to contribute back to the stabilization fund. And so we'll pause there for any discussion or comments, questions on those other funds. before we talk about these alternative scenarios that we looked at.
Okay, I don't have anything.
The only thing that jumped out at me was what you just said about the revenue stabilization fund being entirely dependent on the health of the general fund. I think what has been the practice in the past is that the revenue stabilization fund was entirely dependent on fat timber years.
Yeah, yeah.
We can't expect anymore.
Mhm.
I don't have anything other than.
Okay, I have no hands up next, so you can move along if you'd like.
Okay, so for our stress test analysis, this is where we're running alternative sets of assumptions to see how they impact the end result of our forecast. So, as a stress test implies, we're usually looking at more pessimistic assumptions. What happens if revenues go down more than we expect? What happens if costs are higher than we expect? What happens if that's sustained over time or a one-time shock to the system? So scenarios 1 through 4 that we ran were all negative stress tests to see how small changes in the financial performance wind up impacting the projected deficit in future years. Scenarios 5 and 6, we lump them into our stress test analysis, but these are positive scenarios. These are saying, what if actions are able to be taken that improve the financial outcomes for the county general fund? How would that play out in terms of the impact on the county's finances? So just to quickly run through these, scenario 1, we reduced the revenues from our baseline scenario by 1 percentage point each year. No change on the expenditures. Scenario 2 was no change in our revenue forecast, but we increased the growth in expenditures by 1% per year. Scenario 3 was a one-time 10% drop in our revenue forecast. If there was some sort of negative event, in reality, if we had something like a major recession, it would play out sort of in a more ripple effect where you might have a drop in TLT revenue in year 1, but it's not until year 3 that you see the reduction in property tax revenues that go along with it, et cetera. This just shows a one-time 10% shock to the system, and then everything continues at the projected pace. And then scenario 4 combined both of the first two scenarios. It is reduced revenues and increased expenditures. Scenario 5 on the positive side of things is the opposite of 4. Here we have increased revenue and decreased growth in expenditures. And then scenario 6 is maybe the most, realistic scenario, where it takes all of our baseline forecasts for the growth in revenues and expenditures, but it says, what if we were able to look at other funds? I see a typo there, but we looked at other funds to be able to contribute an extra $1 million each year into the general fund. What would that look like? That gives us this slide that is both very useful and very busy. So this is showing the baseline forecast, the solid black line. This is the annual deficit in the general fund each year. And then we have all of our different alternative scenarios above and below that line. Just to look at that baseline scenario, we currently project for the current year about $1 million deficit. We anticipate that deficit would hover around that level for the next couple of future years as well, buoyed by the relatively strong timber revenue that we anticipate over this period of time. But once we get beyond 2028, this structural deficit really emerges here, where we anticipate revenues to not grow as rapidly as expenditures. And that leads to this growing deficit year over year, unless corrective action is taken. And by the time we get 10 years out in the future, we're looking at an annual deficit of the order of magnitude of $5 million. Instead of now where your budget conversations may be looking at how can we solve something of more of the $1 million magnitude. When we look at all of the negative stress test scenarios, obviously they perform worse than the baseline. That's intentional. We structured them to try and push the revenues and expenditures in negative ways. One thing that I think comes from this, rather than focusing on any one of those scenarios, is again relatively small changes in the assumptions. If due to Middle East instability, we have high gas prices, and that kicks inflation back up to a higher level, and so over this next decade, we have inflation that is 1 percentage point higher than we were previously forecasting, that puts a lot of pressure on the budget. Instead of having an annual deficit of $5 million a decade from now, you're looking at an annual deficit close to $8 million at that point in time. So relatively small changes in the assumptions can have these big impacts on the overall deficits or surpluses that we're forecasting here. When we look at our two positive scenarios, let's start with scenario 6. That's the one where we are assuming everything stays the same, but you have an extra $1 million per year in revenue that's being transferred from some other fund in the county into the general fund. If you're looking at a short-term forecast, that looks like it just about gets the job done. You can see that purple line is hovering right around at the break-even point for 26, 27, 28. It even gets into positive territory. But it's not solving that structural deficit, the projection for revenues to not grow as fast as costs. And so long-term, just plugging an extra $1 million into the hole isn't going to be enough to fill that hole. And so we could see by the time you get to 2035, instead of a $5 million deficit, it's a $4 million deficit. It's not a structural solution to the problem. Scenario 5 is the one scenario where we ratcheted the revenues up by 1 percentage point per year. If there are a combination of policy actions you can take to get revenues growing a little bit more robust than we currently anticipate, and it ratchets expenditures down by about 1 percentage point per year. If you're able to control costs in some way, rather than the unconstrained cost approach that we used in our forecast. The combination of those two changes, 1 percentage point more on revenues and less on expenditures, does put the county back into a path towards financial sustainability. We do show a few years of deficits, in the near future, but long term we see that improving, and the long term trajectory is positive in that scenario. So I would say that the difference between scenario 5 and scenario 4, that really illustrates the range of realistic outcomes of what could happen if we have minor tweaks in how we anticipate revenues or expenditures to grow into the future. And there is certainly one alternative where the county, is addressing these issues and focusing on finances that leads to positive financial sustainability. But there are plenty of alternatives, if these issues are not addressed, that lead to sustained ongoing deficits. So we'll pause there to talk about the stress tests, and then I just have a couple of final conclusion slides.
Great, thanks, Nick. I just want to go back to that 2 slides back. And this is just like a dumb, my question. Like when you're saying stuff like, I just think it's unrealistic that expenditures are going to drop down just because of the cost of things going up. So my question is, that figure works. If I increase my baseline by 3% and no change, I'm just trying to figure out what these numbers truly mean, because I don't think, expenditures, like the price of gas, we don't have a control over that. Okay, the sheriff's office needs the gas that they use every year. And so that's not something we can cut. We could cut positions, and I know we could cut positions for expenditures, but I'm just wondering is, this works even if we exceed our revenue by a higher percentage than if we don't have much of a change in decreasing expenditures. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. This is just a quick way to show the magnitude of these changes. I will say that you have in the past, used strategies. There's strategies that folks have talked about today as not being desirable, but at keeping costs down. So, we've talked about how across the country, we have seen personnel costs for state and local governments outpace the background inflation rate by about 1 percentage point per year. We haven't really seen that at Tillamook County. We've seen your personnel costs growing at around the same rate as general inflation. That may have been done by having compensation that is not desirable in some way, or not having the benefits that you'd like to offer, or having, cutting positions. But there are certainly strategies that you have used that would achieve this kind of reduction in costs compared to the baseline. So this isn't assuming that costs go down. It's just that costs are 1 percentage point lower in growth rate than our baseline assumptions.
Right. But the problem is we did have to just catch up from decades of
Yep.
not not paying market rate on anything and losing
Yep.
people.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly from there are ways that when you're looking at improving your financial performance, the ideal way is through improved efficiency. Let's say that all the news headlines you read every week wind up proving true, and artificial intelligence is a home run for society, and you're able to use it in ways to get lots more productivity out of the same or reduced number of personnel. That's one way that you can wind up having your cost increases reduced in future years by increased productivity. I don't know how realistic that particular example is. The next best way to handle improve financial performance is by receiving external funding from elsewhere. You're able to, the state gets more timber revenue, and that comes to save the day, or there's more federal or state grants. That's tremendous if you can get it, but it's very hard for you to control. It's very hard for you to plan on, and not something you want to bank on for your strategy of success. And so then you're looked at, the two remaining levers that you can pull is making painful changes to decrease your costs by laying off folks or decreasing compensation in some way, reducing the level of service, or by increasing revenues, which mostly will hit your local population, not all of them, and to the extent that you can, impact the tourists without negatively changing the demand for tourism. Is a great way to do it. But, growing revenues and making those painful cost cutting, some combination of that is likely to be needed. We ran a scenario that showed both of those happening. In reality, you may need to rely more on one than the other.
Okay. I don't think there's no other hands up.
So our final conclusions, I don't think, again, anything here is going to be shocking. You folks are living this year after year. But, this report provides the solid foundation of technical analysis to really drive these points home. So first off, the county should adopt additional financial policies following national best practices. We know that that's been on the radar for county staff for a while, and it can certainly help navigate you through more challenging financial times if you have solid policies to rely on. The general fund has been in a deficit for 5 straight years. That's a key takeaway. Right now, there's no sight that that's looking like it's going to get better without course corrections and decisions that are made by the county commission. The general fund is heavily reliant on property taxes and state timber revenue. Those two sources of revenue are far and away the largest sources of revenue, and they impact a lot of what the budget can do. The various challenges facing the county are not unique. I don't know if this really came through during the presentation today, but governments across the country, they view taxation as a 3-legged stool. And those 3 legs are sales tax, income tax, and property tax. And cities and counties in Oregon basically have a 1-leg stool. And that is not a great foundation for you to be sitting on. So with the general public repeatedly voting down broad-based sales taxes, and with income tax in Oregon, redirected to the state, not the local level, local jurisdictions are left to depend almost entirely on property tax. And that's true for Tillamook County, for every city and county across the state. Timber revenue, that's a statewide challenge, and there are so many counties across the state that are suffering that same issue. The high inflation that we've seen driving up costs in recent years, and that we anticipate to remain a little stubbornly high in future years, that's an issue not just for the county, but every government organization, every household across the country. These financial challenges are projected to worsen. Again, this is largely driven by the stagnant revenues for timber and the slow but dependable growth in revenue for property taxes, just not being able to do enough to keep up with a growing population and inflation rates that drive your growth in costs. We do see, however, from that stress test analysis, that small changes in the assumptions can lead to big impacts on the operating budget, surplus or deficit. And so if the county is able to make some small changes to increase revenues or reduce costs, it could pay big dividends when you look at the next 10 years of future financial performance. This long-term analysis, I think, is just a different perspective compared to the annual budget process to help guide these future county decisions when it comes to finances. What can you do that's going to pay dividends 10 years from now, not just solving next year's particular budget crisis? The county, if they move forward with a county financial plan, can build off of this analysis as well as all the other investigative work and priority setting work, evaluating potential revenue solutions that the county's been doing over the last couple of years. Build on all these pieces of analysis that have been done and turn it into concrete actions that will help improve the county's financial position. And although we're done with the presentation today, this does not need to be a one-time analysis that just sits on a shelf, but this creates a tool that county staff now have access to and will be trained on to be able to change and rerun these assumptions for different scenarios in the future as you consider the impacts of potential new revenues or other policy changes. So with that, we finally made it to the end of the presentation. Thank you for bearing with me through that today. Sorry we took up so much of your time, but I know that this long-term revenue picture and financial forecast are pretty critical for the county. So.
Well, we appreciate that, Nick, and yeah, we definitely need this going into our budget season. It's going to definitely spur some good conversations and questions. Does anybody have any other questions for Nick in the room?
My question is, does Deborah already have this? Are we able to input the new TLT information and have a new look as we walk into budget? Because that is a potential big opportunity to give a different look at a stress test.
We just talked about that earlier this week. This is a big spreadsheet that Deborah and Rachel have seen, but we want to do a training session to make sure that we go through all the individual levers in here, and that if there was a specific policy like the state legislative change to TLT and how that could ripple through your budget, we could do that at that time. So we'd have a training session in the very near future to help make sure your staff are well trained on this model and look at any tweaks to the assumptions we want to show at that point in time.
I would agree with. I will tell you, I will completely go crazy if we're going into the budget season without at least considering the things that we've already done.
Oh yeah.
Increased fees. Some of the things that Nick was speaking to is like as if we haven't done it yet, but we have done quite a bit, even with some of the survey, the fees, we've increased fees. It's about, if we go by current numbers, about $1.7 million is the 20% of the DLT that we would be able to use right directly in our general fund once we develop policies for it. But that's a huge lever that will be happening as well. For me to stay calm, I just want to make sure that, and I know you know that, but
yeah.
we historically, we've sometimes gone into budget, without talking about, we still have one timber payment left, which we do. And so I just want to make sure that we sit down, and it might be changing because things are progressing, but I just want to make sure, and I don't care if it's optimistic or negative, I just want a real number. It's very important for me to have, because $1 million of difference changes the trajectory of everything we just talked about.
Right.
Yeah.
And
And we still have the $1 million that we're already doing the transfer. We're not talking about losing that.
yeah,
So
exactly.
that's on top of the current transfer.
Right. I agree.
And that's some conversation for us to have to say, are we taking it all this year? So I think having a couple of different models to look at to say, what if we just do the $1 million transfer, which is part of number 5, I think that was on here, or number 6. And then what if we took the $1 million transfer plus 1 million and left 0.7, just a couple things so we can begin to see the relative impact,
Putting
I
money
think
back
would
in
be
the,
helpful.
right, putting money back into the reserve fund.
And to the capital project.
capital-
and all-
Exactly.
All those things,
Again,
right?
I'm
So
not
yeah,
saying that it's all the whole,
no,
I'm just saying that we have to, we can't pretend it's not there.
right. Let's look
Because,
at it.
and all the good work that like people have been doing, as far as to Nick's point, we have looked at AI and we are doing that. So there are some examples, I think, of that where we've looked at technology and not filled a vacancy, and maybe won't going forward. And then anyway.
Yeah, on the top of the list of conclusions, the adopting additional financial policies, I thought we can use AI for that. You know, really, I mean, there are a lot of opportunities for efficiency through AI.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Nick. If we have, we
Yeah,
appreciate,
this is great.
it was a great presentation and very helpful.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for your insightful comments. I'll make sure to work with Rachel and Deborah to incorporate them. The report was still in draft format, so all of your comments can be incorporated. So
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Mhm.
Thank you, Deborah.
Yes, thank you both very much.
Great work.
That's exceptional work.
It's like when I spoke to Rachel earlier, I said, I was gonna say, do you guys want to say anything else about this process, Brandon, before we move on?
Not today.
Okay. I'm just really happy we have this work.
Mhm.
It's such a good idea for us to take this snapshot and say, we're doing stuff, but if we weren't, we would really, really be in bad shape. Like most other 60% of counties. I'm doing all this looking up at stats. It's like 6% of Oregon counties are facing huge deficits.
Mhm.
And because of the same kind of reasons, a lot of them the same reasons we are. And I just want to say that I think that our staff and like we're prepared to do the important work. So
Yeah, we're in the process.
we're in the process.
Yes.
And we're so glad to have you figuring this out and be able to plug those numbers in and help us out. So thank you so much. Okay, moving along. We think we should talk about the,
Sure, you guys want to talk about the timber stuff?
Yeah.
I wish that I had an answer for you. So what I don't.
did you give
Go
it
ahead.
just a quick summary of what we're talking about?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we're talking
So-
about,
How much have you been listening? How much have you learned?
I've learned
Let's
quite a
go.
bit, but let's. let you
So
do
we're
this.
talking about ONC timber, but we're talking about it in the context of a land donation that the Grand Ronde Tribe is asking the federal government to do for them. So the Grand Ronde Tribe has outlined a section of about 26,000 acres, I believe, of land that they are requesting the federal government give to them to add to their reservation lands. So we had the opportunity to go and have a great visit with the tribal council and Grand Ronde's forestry folks and take a look at this piece of land. And what they're asking us to do is to provide a letter of support for the donation. So great visit, really, interesting to see how they manage their lands and where they're headed with that and what this would look like. We're able to ask some of our really important questions there around, would it still be open to the public? The answer is yes. There are recreation facilities within that. Will those operate? Yes. So will the public actually see a difference? Probably not. However, the other thing that came up as we talked about it as county is that we receive revenue off of Forest Service lands when they're harvested. So we receive 25% of those revenues to the county when we're not receiving SRS. So it's this kind of complicated window. But what makes it even more complicated is that in receiving the map of the lands that they have requested for donation, there appear to be some of the Oregon California Railroad lands there are ONC timberlands. And the ONC timberlands are lands that there are 18 counties that have them, and it's also a place where we receive revenue share when there is harvest on ONC timberlands. The difference with Forest Service, we receive 25% of what is harvested and or recreationally what is earned. So that comes, and what happens in Tillamook County comes to Tillamook County. So it's a very direct revenue relationship, if you will. So as we look at this, there are roughly, I think it was 10,000 or 12,000 of the acres are in Tillamook County. 15,000 of the acres are in Tillamook County that they have asked for. So we're started the conversation and thinking, so that would be Forest Service, 15,000 acres for which we would not receive revenue in the future for harvest. Is there a partnership or a way that we might work with the tribes to come up with something mutual beneficial? So I'm delighted that you guys will be meeting with them on Friday and to kind of talk through that. But the snafu that occurred was in looking, oh, go ahead.
So did we come up with a estimate of what that is, the 25% USFS?
It's really hard to say because every year is different, right? No, and I know you sent me some stuff and I'm looking to see if I have the right piece of paper here. On the very back of an envelope, the very back of an envelope, that 15,000 acres is roughly, I believe it is 12% of our acres. Yes. So the trick was, if you're talking about an SRS year, you're talking about 12% of $500,000 to $600,000. If you're talking about a receipts year, so there was no SRS and we simply received harvest, then you're talking about 12 to 15% of $50,000 to $200,000. So it's exceptionally variable, which is what makes it difficult to say what that number is. So on an average, I think I went back and looked and it was about $75,000 a year. If we said, well, let's average the last, I think you gave me the last however many years it was, 8 or 10 years. And it's like on average, we would be foregoing roughly $75,000 in revenue per year.
Okay, so you just said 12 to 15%
Yes.
of
Our
600,000 in harvest?
in 600,000 is SRS years.
Oh, SRS, okay.
Those are SRS years, which is part of what makes this tricky, is trying to figure out which is which and how much we forego. And then in a harvest year, it's almost impossible to say because we just don't know what we're going to get.
And is that the county share, or does that include the schools?
The 600,000 is the county share, am I correct?
When we say county, that's county roads.
County roads.
That's what I'm saying, so
Yeah.
75,000 number, that number is the money that we go towards, that goes towards roads.
So I think we would also need a figure for how much the schools would lose from SRS.
Okay, we can pull all that together. It's, but we're not gonna have all that. Maybe we'll have that for Friday, probably not.
I will work on that right now.
Okay, maybe we will. Deborah might be able to do that right sitting here, which would be fantastic. So that's the Forest Service lands. But so the SRS, when you look at that, that is Forest Service and ONC squished together. So in a year that we do timber harvest, ONC is separate. Those come to us. I believe those are general fund at that point, and Forest Service continues to be shared. In a year that we do SRS, they lump it all together, and I don't believe we get to pull that apart. So it's again, it's hard to say, here's the number, right? So so that's the overarching. The piece that I'm working on right now is to try and figure out for sure, are there ONC lands in here? The original information said there are no ONC lands, it's all Forest Service. But the map that the Forest Service sent shows ONC lands designated in this area.
Mhm.
So no one's quite certain. So that's the first thing I'm trying to get to for sure is, are these truly ONC lands?
Mhm.
If they are ONC lands, the understanding is that there is an ability at the federal level to move that ONC designation to a different set of lands. You just say, oh, there's 4,126 acres of ONC lands identified in this parcel that they're or this section they're requesting for donation. We will, go to this part of the forest and donate these or designate these as ONC lands, which allows the ONC designation to remain. It allows the county to continue to receive our revenues off ONC, and would reduce the amount of given away acres, if you will, if you're an SRS,
Mhm.
because we just have a different piece of the land that's considered ONC.
Okay.
So that is what I'm working through right now, is I'm trying to figure out the ONC part to determine, are these absolutely and for sure ONC lands? And if they are, what is the process for designating different lands as ONC in order to maintain the benefit to the county and not lose ONC lands?
Okay. All right.
That's what I'm working my way through.
If we can't do that, then are we interested in asking that the ONC lands that appear to be on the map be excluded?
I think we would.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is because it is an 18 county land pool for ONC revenues.
Mhm.
What we do impacts the entire all 18 counties of ONC.
Agreed.
So, yeah. So I think if not, we would ask to be excluded.
All right. So the closest number we have at the moment for for potential lost revenue is 75,000, but that's back of the envelope number.
You have something better than that, Deborah. That was my back of the envelope. I just looked at the number of acres and
And that's just for us and not for school. So,
Roads really get, so if we're looking at SRS distributions, roads get 75%, county schools get 25%. There's a small, prior to that dispersal, there's a small sequestration that stays at the state. So really when we think of that 75% number, that's the lion's share of the loss. County schools would be
25% of six, of whatever the number was.
well, what Aaron said was 12 to 15% of 600,000.
So it would be 75% of 12% of six.
unless we pull out the ONC acres and then it gets smaller and then it gets different again.
right.
You're putting the pressure on to give us the number right now.
I know.
Yeah.
Very busy, yeah. Well done.
Well, yeah,
Let's-
you have a day. We're going on Friday.
Around $20,000 per year for the school
Okay.
on average.
And I just want to reiterate to everybody, the discussion we're having is about the letter of support, that Congress is the one that makes the decision
Correct.
regarding
Yeah.
if this land transfer happens. It's not a county
Correct.
decision.
I have, however, been in contact with Merkley's office. They have not yet dropped the bill. And they're like, yeah, let us know what you figure out. So I think that while we do not have ultimate control, at the end of the day, the tribe can say, we're moving forward with our request. Merkley's office can say, we're moving forward with the request, and it will happen with or without us. But I think there is a desire, and I think that desire is true at this board, at the tribal council, in Merkley's office. I think the desire is that we work together to create something that we can all feel good about, that nobody wants to do anything to anyone. Everyone would like to work with. And I think that's the spirit that we're moving forward in right now, is working with. So, I mean, that's certainly what I felt in the conversation so far.
Okay.
Okay, so Deborah, if you come up with numbers that Paul and I can talk about with more authority on Friday, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'd look at,
Don't,
yeah, because it's 12% of acres that if you don't remove the ONC, it would be, so if we redesignated ONC elsewhere, it's 12% of Tillamook County's Forest Service acres. So it would be 12% of whatever our portion of that is. Except SRS includes other acres that we
When
don't
you
even know about, because I can't get BLM to call me back either about the other acres, so.
so when you said 12 to 15, it's not 15, it's just 12.
It's 12. Yeah, it's 12%. I found my number. Sorry, my brain was.
Okay,
Another napkin.
No, I found it on the map. If I put my glasses on, I can see the small notes that I wrote instead of just the big notes that I wrote.
Do you have what you need, Commissioner Bell?
I think I have as much as we have at the moment.
Well, and I think that's part of the message, I think, for the tribal council, is just that this is complex in the timber world. And I've had this conversation. I talked to Kelly Dirksen right before we came into this meeting, their forestry person. And he understands the complexity of what we're trying to tease apart. And so I think that's part of the message for the tribal council, is it's a little bit complex, and we're working through exactly what that means for us in terms of, what we are foregoing that we may need to answer to our residents for,
For sure.
which is how I have framed it for them. It's not that we are against, the fact that they should have this land. It's that we have to answer to our folks as to what exactly the impacts are. And so we know there's some really great things, which is the public lands remain, they'll be well managed, the recreation facilities will remain open, and they talked about even improvements for recreation. So there's some really good things coming
True.
as well.
Okay, and the 75,000 that's for roads. It's not, it's not in the general fund, it's for roads.
Right, so when SRS is in place,
Yeah, in an SRS year.
general fund does not get any portion of the SRS revenue. If it was a non-SRS year, we do have the opportunity or the ability to keep a portion of the revenue sharing amount.
Okay. Okay. All right. This is helpful. And maybe we all received, the Confederated Tribes sent letters to people who are adjacent property that the tribe is requesting. So maybe we all received emails from people, but I did. I received two emails from people who live there.
I
Oh,
have not.
Okay,
So
so
please share.
yeah, I received 2 emails from people who live up there at Blaine, who received letters from the tribal council, but I haven't seen the letter. It would be interesting to see it. And they just had a lot of questions. So I asked them to send me their questions and said that we will relate their questions in the meeting on Friday. Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. Great.
Okay. Yeah, we have 5 minutes. Well, that clock's rolling. We have 4 minutes unless we want to go longer. I'm willing to forego the NACO debrief. I don't think that's time specific. I would like to flag some of the Oceanside stuff because that is coming up on the time. Is that okay? Rachel, do you gonna still want to talk about? Okay. Well, I met with Jason Elkins, the Cape Lookout State Park Manager, and Justin, can't think of his name. He's Mitchell, I think. He is the district manager and works out of Astoria up at Fort Stevens. Regarding, if everybody doesn't know this, Justin Parker, thank you so much. I was thinking of Commissioner Mitchell, because anyway, the the Cape Lookout State Park is doing 2 things. One, they're closing the park for at least 8 months for some much needed repairs. This was supposed to happen last year when both parks were going to close, and the impact to the county is significant. An 8-month closure is about a $92,000 cut in our TLT. And that's a $28,000 cut to county roads out of that percentage that we currently have. Technically would be more than that if we're at 50-50 with the new percentage. So this is a significant thing. So one of a separate part, that's just an issue that I think that the county should be aware of, that county parks might need to be aware, maybe discussing about increasing some inventory if that's possible for those people. So that's gonna be devastating to places like the Schooner and those restaurants that rely on those visitors. But the other more pressing thing is the Oceanside Wayside parking lot. The state park statewide is implementing day use fees at properties that they didn't do before, and they're looking at doing it, and they're determined to do it at this point. So I had this meeting with them to see if there was any other options that we could kind of hammer out and then bring back to this group to discuss if it was possible. So when I had this meeting, I pointed out that it's one, we have an ongoing, the neighbors are very concerned with, the price goes in there as a QR code. There's no internet. How are you going to buy a ticket or buy a day pass? Is this concerned about Rosenberg Loop because the state, we own some of that and so does the state. The concern with the public in Oceanside is that people will park on the street and block the street. And of course, the bigger problem there is even a couple of cars additionally on the street can be impossible for a fire truck to get around. So parking out there is a big deal. So I understand their concerns. So the other concern that we have to have going in there is the county, it's a county road that is the entrance and egress of that parking lot. So the only roads going into this parking lot are owned by the county. The only access to the beach is the ramp and staircase that the county put in. We have invested, I looked it up, but in the last few years, the county through TLT grants and road department work on the road and staircase, which is ADA accessible, the only access to the beach is over $376,000 that we've invested in that area for parking lot improvements and everything else. So I basically was trying to point out that we are actually partners in that, and that we own not only the roads leading in and the road to the ramp or to the beach, we own the only road that drives through the property. So we have a vested interest in that, and we're just trying to see what our options might be, whether they might reconsider charging this, and of course, they said they don't have the decision at that level. They'd have to bring it up, so I'll probably end up sending an email and make sure I CC everybody about some of these discussions. They're open to anything, but they're getting their direction from above that pay grade. A couple of things that they wanted to share was they have identified 2 parking spots on the upper parking lot by the community club that would be 15-minute parking for post office access, which was nice. I had asked if it would be possible for them to honor our day use pass, which might be helpful to a lot of citizens so that they could use our, my initial answer from people at OPRD at the parks was no, because we ended all of our mutual, and I was trying to explain that, one, we have a unique situation here. It's not like you're driving in the Cape Lookout and then going to their day use. This is you're on county road, using our road to get to the beach and to the parking lot. So I feel like this is a unique site. We also, based on something that I think Chris, Lady and I had talked about, was when they had talked about maybe letting us run the parking lot like we do for Cape Kiwanis for Bob Straub, we run the boat ramp for the state. So there is a precedent of us doing that where we will manage the parking lot. Because the reason they're doing this is they're hurting on money. So I asked them what their projected revenue would be. They didn't have it. They didn't know it. They said somebody in Salem has it. I asked, would it be easy just to let us do it? And would that be something they'd be into? Of course, they couldn't answer that. So I'm just throwing all the options of trying to figure out solutions. Either don't charge, let us figure out what we want to do with it, make it part of accept our passes there, and maybe we accept your pass at VTAR. Like I was just trying to figure out anything to get it in, because thanks to county council, we are working towards ways to possibly get reduced day use passes for locals, kind of way there. So that's where we're at. They're very receptive. They're both really good guys, and they
So
really.
are they gonna take it up or do you need to take it?
I'm
Because I
gonna-
did get an answer back from JR and I told him that,
What was
you
the
were-
answer?
so I told him you were taking this on and that that I was gonna step away, but I'm sure that it would be brought to him if
Right.
needed. So I don't know if his people are taking it or if you would like
So,
to forward that email to you.
Well, it's a good idea. I don't know what my next step should be. I was just gonna send them a follow-up email with this information for them to forward.
Mhm.
And I trust them to do that. So I think that was my next step. If you guys are okay with that, I would just basically recap what I just said. And what we talked about in the meetings is, we're open to having discussions about some other solutions. To maybe to that problem. So I wanted the people on the Ocean side to know, nobody's on, but that we're not
Word will
just
get out.
letting it happen and not working on it. And they are, locally, the managers understand that this is a big deal.
Yeah, I appreciate you advocating. I think we should be careful about, not that you're not, but I'm cognizant as the parks liaison about being careful about saying, well, let us take it over for you, because if we had to pay to maintain the bathroom, we might want to charge our own day use fee.
And I think that's an option for us to do too. It's included as our day use areas.
Mhm.
That's what I would.
Okay, okay. So I was thinking.
Just like
that you're-
Bob Straub, we collect a fee for parking.
Correct. Okay, I misunderstood because I was thinking your goal was to not have a fee.
No.
Okay.
No, if they're gonna keep it, not to have a fee. If we were to maintain it, we would use our day use fees.
Okay.
And we would expand, the parking lot above, the road above could be expanded at additional spots. So,
Okay.
yeah, no, absolutely not. I'm not about giving anything for free.
Okay.
And they were talking about putting a cellular booster in the
They do have a
bathroom.
Wi-Fi booster. in
Do
the
they have it
bathroom.
in already?
I don't think, he didn't say they had it, but they planned on it.
So let's not take it over till that's installed and
So anyways, that's where I'm at, and I will CC you
Yeah,
both
thanks
on it,
for
so at
working
least
on
you have the information of what I said, and then if you want to add something to them, you can send it to them yourself.
Sure.
All right.
Okay.
Well, with that, if there's nothing else, I'm gonna go ahead and adjourn this meeting. That good? Yeah, 4:03 or 4:04.